In this video, we're gonna be taking a look at the PPC03 Power Rack and Cable Crossover Combo by RitFit. We actually looked at their 2.8K package in the last video, and I mentioned that I wanted to take a whole dedicated video just to talk about the rack because there's quite a bit to say here. And just to kick things off with the dimensions, this is a 2x2 rack. But one thing that I like about this is it's a true 2x2 rack, whereas some of the other racks that are imported, they may say that they're 2x2 or 2x3 or 3x3, but they're actually a close approximation. So this rack, for example, is not actually 2x2. This is a 6 centimeter by 6 centimeter rack. So it's like 2.5 inches roughly. And the reason why that matters is for attachments. 2x2, 2x3, 3x3 are all relatively standard sizes. And so you're going to be able to find attachments more easily for a 2x2 rack, an actual 2x2 rack, versus something that is approximately 2x2. The width of the rack is about 43.5 inches, but of course, if you're wanting to know the width, really what you need to know is the length of a barbell, because that's going to be wider than the widest point of your rack. So if you're allotting space for a rack, you actually need to allot, more than 87 inches. So you need to allot about 8 feet so that you actually have room to have the barbell and then have room to load the plates. I would say you need a minimum of 8 feet for a power rack. And this rack is 7.5 inches to the top of the pull-up bar, and then the pulley itself is actually just a hair taller than the pull-up bar at 85 inches, so 7'1". So it's a pretty compact rack. It's a rack that's going to fit in pretty much any house if you have more than a 7-foot ceiling. And this rack comes with a few accessories as well. Of course, there's the cable. It comes with single handles. It comes with a lat pull down handle. It comes with a small handle, which to be honest, I could have just done without this. They could have just ditched this and given a slightly higher quality lat pull down handle, because this is pretty narrow for me and anyone bigger than me. It's pretty narrow. So unless you're a smaller individual, that's a less than shoulder width grip bar. And I would actually just use the lat pull down bar for push downs or curls or anything like that instead, and I'm never going to use this bar. There are also half rack style safeties, which also kind of gives away how they intend for you to use this rack, because the safeties are for the outside of the rack rather than internal safeties for inside the rack. So it seems to me that they intend for you to use this as a half rack, but of course there are holes on all 4 uprights, so you can do things inside the rack if you want to. Another really cool feature about this rack versus some of the other racks in this style and this price category, because there are a lot of them, most of them have fixed foot plates for the low rows, whereas this is actually removable. You just flip it, pull it out, and it can be out of the way. And I like that versus a fixed foot plate, because you're really only ever going to use the foot plate for one exercise, or well, one type of exercise. I guess you could count the different hand grips of rows as different exercises, but one group of exercises. And if you're not doing rows, you're probably not using this. And that means it's in the way the rest of the time. Whereas with this one, you can take it off, set it out of the way, and only have it on the rack when you're actually using it. And then on the landmine side over here, it's the same thing. A lot of them are fixed to the rack, whereas this one, you can take it off and have it out of the way. And for me personally, I actually don't do a whole lot of landmine exercises myself. It's pretty rare occasion where I actually use a landmine. So I would have this out of the way all of the time, whereas with this rack over here, for example, you can't see it, I don't think, but it's attached to the rack. And so the 99% of the time that I'm not using it, it's still there. And another thing that I pointed out in the previous video One thing I don't like about this landmine is the bracket on the landmine is a little bit bigger than it really needs to be. And so when it sits down, it doesn't set all the way down. You can see that the bracket hits the ground rather than the front of the opening hitting the ground. And the reason why that's a big deal is when you put the bar in and all that weight is pressing down, it actually lifts the rack up off the ground, as you can see there. So if you have this like in a spare bedroom or something like that, it will be digging into your floors. If you have rubber floors like this, it's probably not a big deal. Or if you have maybe even like carpet or something, it's not a big deal. But if you have hardwood floors or some other type of hard flooring that could be scuffed up or gouged, then you're gonna wanna put something under this. And then just kind of slowly working our way backwards into the rack. One of the main pieces of the rack, of course, is the pulley. And I really like this pulley. It is pretty smooth. And the way you adjust it is pretty smooth as well. It has a little screw pop pin. So you unscrew it to loosen it, pop it, boom, give it a couple twists to tighten it back up. And the reason why I like this style is, as I said in the last video, it allows there to be a little bit looser of a tolerance because you're gonna be tightening it down to secure it anyway. And so it allows for easy one-handed adjustment. And the cables themselves are really smooth. That is one thing that I was worried about when I first agreed to do this review, was with it being such a budget piece of equipment, I've used some pretty bad cables in my life. And so I was worried that this was just gonna be an absolute piece of garbage. But to my surprise, it is actually very, very smooth. And am I gonna say that it's as good as a dedicated functional trainer? Of course not. Those are two completely separate categories of things. A dedicated functional trainer is going to be, you know, several $100s by itself if it's plate loaded, or if it's selectorized, it could be all the way up into the thousands. And this is not that. But one thing that I can say is this thing is actually pretty close considering the astronomical price difference. The functional trainer, the Rep FT5000 that I've reviewed here on the channel that we have over on the other side of the gym, it was around $2,500, I believe. And this is a $670 rack, and that is a huge price gap. I don't know that there is a nearly $2,000 price gap of a difference between this smoothness and the smoothness over there. So if that's one thing that you're worried about or hesitant about when it comes to purchasing or not purchasing this rack, I would say that you don't have to worry about that. It's actually pretty smooth. Now, when it comes to the cable trolley, I feel like the arms on the trolleys are a little bit on the short side. They're only 8.5 inches long, which isn't a big deal if you're using metal plates, because you're gonna be able to load plenty of metal plates on 8.5 inches, but it is a problem if you are using bumper plates, because with the bumper plate package that we got, and I showed you in the previous video, you can only put 270 pounds worth of bumper plates on here, whereas the actual trolley itself is rated for 400 pounds. So something to keep in mind that could be solved either by using iron plate, or if the arms were just a little bit longer, because there is plenty of room to extend that out at least a couple more inches so that you can put a little bit more weight on there. And another thing that I do like about the cable trolley is that the arms are at a tiny bit of an angle, so that when you put the plates on there, they want to slide towards the center, whereas some trolleys have a perfectly horizontal arm. And so if you're jostling the weights around, they might have a tendency to want to scoot out slowly towards the end. But with this rack, they thought of that already. And if the weights are jostled, it doesn't matter, because it just makes it want to return back to the center. And continuing to work our way backwards towards the back of the rack, another small thing that is appreciated is I like the J-cups better than some of the other J-cups that I have seen in this price category. It is a completely covered J-cup. There's no metal touching the bar. You have your plastic keeping the bar from touching the metal of the J-cups, which is something that is a nice touch, especially considering some very expensive racks still come with J-cups where the front lip is metal, or there's at some point where the bar is touching metal. So it's great that a rack at this low of a price point actually has a pretty decent J-cup here. And then as we make our way to the very back, one thing that I do love about this rack is the fact that it has weight storage coming off of each side. They really thought of how to maximize the space here, because you have to have that space anyway to allow tolerance for the weights that are going to be on the trolley. So then they were just like, hey, we can put a little mini weight tree on each side so that you can have a place to put your plates. And then it does come with 2 additional weight arms that can be moved and put wherever you want them on the rack, which goes back to what I mentioned earlier about using it as a half rack, because to be honest, there's a lot going on back here, and while you can do things inside the rack, it is built to be able to do that. I found myself, when using this rack, mostly doing things off of the front of the rack. And while I do absolutely love this rack, I do think there are a couple of places where it has room for improvement. One, the pull-up bar is not knurled. I would have loved to have seen a knurled pull-up bar. 2, the holes are actually pretty far apart. I've seen other racks in this category that have holes a little bit closer together. These holes are far enough apart that I actually had a little bit of trouble finding the sweet spot when I was benching specifically, because when I first guessed at the right spot, it was a little bit too low. And when I went to re-rack it, I actually went just barely over the J-cups and hit the upright. And then I moved it up a notch. And then when I went to re-rack it the next time, I actually had to, push my shoulders up just a little bit to be able to hoist it over the lip of the front of the J-cup. And so there wasn't, for me, really a sweet spot. I had to go back down, because I'm like, hey, if I'm gonna go anywhere near failure and I actually have to get it back up into the J-cups in a hurry, I can't do it on the higher notch. So I had to bring it back down and be careful about racking it so that I didn't hit the upright itself. So something to be aware of there. And the hole spacing issue continues on to the base of the rack. On the base of the rack, there are holes for band pegs, and there's only 2 holes for band pegs. Whereas it seems to me that they could have just kept at least the same spacing as the rest of the rack, so that you have a little bit more options for exactly where you want those band pegs to be. That's not an issue for me, because I basically never use band pegs in my own training, but if you are someone who does use band pegs on a somewhat regular basis, then it's just something that you should be aware of. And the final thing about this rack is the powder coating isn't the best. There were a few scratches on the rack when I received it, when I got it out of the box, and I have put a couple of scratches on it myself, which isn't the worst thing in the world, because it is a piece of workout equipment. It is gonna get scratched up, but I feel like it gets scratched up maybe a little bit too easily. But overall, I really think RitFit is on to something when it comes to this budget rack. If I'm being honest, at the beginning of this, there was a small part of me that was a little bit unexcited to do this review, because in the back of my mind, I was like, oh man, I've got that awesome Rogue Monster 6-post rack over there, and now I'm going to this thing for a couple of weeks so that I can test it for this review. And there was a part of me that was a little bit bummed out. But honestly, after having used this rack, while obviously these 2 things are in completely separate categories when it comes to price, the best compliment that I could actually give this thing is I didn't feel like I was missing out. Like, I didn't just find myself actively missing working out inside of my Rogue Monster rack because I was testing this. I still got equally as effective of a workout working out here as I would have gotten working out on the other side of the gym with my Rogue rack. So if you're in the market for a budget rack, definitely check this one out. And if you want this to be a series, if you want me to take several of these racks at this price point, put them head to head, let me know in the comments. I've reached out to a couple of companies already, but let me know if that's something that you want to see me continue to do. I do have a review on the Lion School rack coming up soon. I'm gonna compare these head to head soon, and then if you guys wanna see more of these, I'm gonna get some more racks and add them to this little budget squat rack competition. As always, God bless you and your family, and we'll see you next week. So if you're in the market for a budget rack, but So if you're in the market for a budget rack,